say to yourself, really? A police officer is supposed to be a marriage counselor. They're supposed to be a parent. They're supposed to be a guardian. They're supposed to somehow be clairvoyant and know that crime is going to happen before it happens. We are asking our police to do too much, which is why some of that money has to go into the things that are not very exciting to Joe Scarborough, apparently. So it was interesting to see Brandon Johnson, the mayor of Chicago, talk about those things, and everybody gets bored. Everybody in the media gets bored. They don't want to hear about that. Okay, this interview happened this morning on Morning Joe. Joe Scarborough, Mika Brzezinski interviewing the mayor of Chicago, Brandon Johnson, who was trying to give some nuance and real detailed articulation of what is working with regard to lowering violent crime in Chicago. One would think that a policy discussion about what actually works with regard to crime policy would be something that everybody wants to hear, because it is, obviously crime has been used as a political football for the last 60 years, back in the days of Richard Nixon saying, law and order and all this other stuff. I mean, it just goes on and on and on. Reagan used it. Obviously, Bill Clinton used it with the 94 Clinton crime bill. So here you have the mayor of Chicago, who's on the brink of probably a takeover, some sort of federal takeover, some sort of federal intervention that, of course, no one is asking for of his city, in the same way that Donald Trump has done with Washington, D.C., something that'll probably involve the National Guard entering Chicago, which, again, nobody has asked for. But this interview this morning, and this is August 26, 2025, was one of the dumbest moments I've seen in television in a long time. It really shows you the decline, really, of journalism in this exchange. I'll let this exchange speak for itself, but I will certainly stop the video when we get to the part where it just gets dumber and dumber.
Mayor of Chicago, Brandon Johnson, to respond to what you heard right there. Mayor Johnson, thanks for your time this morning. We appreciate it. I don't have to tell you about the generations-old problem of gun violence on the streets of Chicago. You are making some headway there just in the last couple of years. But what is your response to President Trump as he floats the idea of sending the National Guard into Chicago?
Well, good morning. First of all, a military occupation of the city of Chicago would not only be illegal, but unconstitutional and costly. The city of Chicago is not requesting that federal troops come and occupy our city. In fact, I have not heard any mayor across this country call for American troops to come and occupy our cities. Look, we're working hard every single day to drive violence down in the city of Chicago. Since I've been in office, there's been a precipitous decline in violent crime in every single category. Just this year alone, we have a 32% reduction in homicides, almost 40% reduction in shootings and shooting victims. Robberies are down nearly 35%. Carjackings are down nearly 50%. We're moving in the right direction because we're making critical investments. If this president was actually serious about driving violence down in the city of Chicago and American cities across this country, he would work with mayors to make sure that we have the necessary investments to continue to do the work that we have been doing.
And of course, what has happened is the federal government has actually cut money for crime prevention. I think it's a huge sum. I'll let him say the number if it comes up. And of course, nobody talks about that because that gets us into things that don't get clicks to websites. So we're not talking about that. I'm going to speed up a little bit here.
Across this country.
And what programs would you want funded? What specifically do you consider to be violence prevention programs?
$800 million be used for?
Yeah.
What would the $800 million be used for? So President Trump and his administration have cut $800 million in crime prevention.
Yeah, that's a great question. So we have been working with community violence intervention workers, or CVI. These are community-led organizations that are spending time on the ground in the neighborhoods, working to squash conflict, to prevent retaliation from occurring. Look,
so wraparound services in communities that effectively provide people with the basics and, of course, services to, like he just said, quash disputes. Those are the things that actually stop violent crime. That's the thing that nobody wants to talk about because it's not sexy. Again, it's hard to fit in a headline on the front page of a newspaper. And so there is no nuanced conversation going on in mainstream media about crime.
I live on the west side of Chicago. It's the Austin neighborhood, one of the most dynamic communities in the entire city, but it has been mired in disinvestment. Hired 31,119 young people, and in the mental and behavior.
Again, I'm moving up the interview to get to the dumb part here, and it gets real dumb real fast.
Workers all over the city, so that when mental health crises have a trained professional to be able to address these crises. The other thing that he can help us with is the federal government can help us with. I've revamped the entire detectives bureau within the city of Chicago. And now we have a clearance rate, almost 77%. One of the deterrents of crime is to actually solve it, to bring closure, to bring justice.
Right. To put people in jail who've committed crime and solve the case. That's a big problem in Washington, D.C. The closure rate in Washington, D.C. has always been terrible. People do crimes and then they're not solved. What Washington, D.C. is actually really good at is traffic tickets and any sort of ticketing that collects money for the city and collects millions of dollars.
These are just a few examples that I know mayors across the country are calling for. This president and the federal government has literally declared war on poor people. I remember a time.
Yeah, like, for example, collecting poor people off the streets and no one really knows what's happened to them, and moving tents, people living in tents. Of course, nobody talks about affordable housing, which is one of the things that if you give people the basics, you're going to have less crime, less conflict, less problems. Nobody talks about that. That's just whatever, right?
When presidents declared war on poverty, the federal government has a moral responsibility to do unto the least of these. And that's what we're doing in the city of Chicago.
So let me ask you, Mr. Mayor, those all sound like great programs. I'm curious, would you also...
Now, here's where you say to yourself, I think I'll watch YouTube all day, because there would be a more learned and interesting discussion on YouTube about something like this than it would on so-called legacy media.
Like to get federal funding to help put 5,000 more cops on the street in Chicago. Would that help drive down crime?
So he reroutes the entire conversation back to more cops. It's interesting that he said 5,000 more cops. Would you want money for 5,000 more cops? To this point, the entire discussion has been about how if you do the things for a society and for people in a society that help them just live daily life and provide the basic pillars, shelter, food, etc. What is the federal government cutting? They're cutting healthcare, they're cutting SNAP, and they cut the Section 8 program for affordable housing. Then they cut $800 million in crime prevention. That is what the Trump administration has done. And then Joe Scarborough comes up with, well, wouldn't you want more money for cops?
Well, look, policing by itself is not the full strategy.
No, I understand that. You've talked about the other things you want, and I said those are good and important programs, but I'm asking also, would 5,000 more police officers on the street in Chicago be helpful to go along with all of those social programs that a lot of cities are engaging in and having success with?
Well, look, here's the best way I can put it, Joe, is that in the 90s, when I was in high school, we had 3,000 more police officers and we had 900 people being murdered every single year in Chicago. It's just not policing alone. Of course, we want more detectives.
I know it's not policing alone, but I know it's not policing alone. You've told me.
I know it's not policing alone, but I'm asking about policing alone. I'm asking about 5,000 more cops on the street. Realize under the Clinton crime bill, they put 100,000 more cops on the street. So it's interesting. Like I said, why is he picking 5,000? I have no idea. But the solution to every problem, apparently for Joe Scarborough, is let's put more cops on the street.
Yeah, everything else you want. I'm curious, and this does come down to an ideological difference between people. Do you believe...
Actually, not between people, between the Republicans and the Democrats primarily, right? Although a lot of these Democrats, of course, would be for more cops on the street. Let's do that, right? But we have plenty of cops on the street. We're the most incarcerating country on the planet. Okay. So, I mean, our rate of incarceration in the United States is higher than any other country. So we've got a lot of cops on the street. Then what's even dumber about this question is that on July 4, President Trump signed a bill to put billions and billions more into incarceration and detention with regard to ICE. I think somebody out there had the statistic that ICE is now going to be a bigger agency with more money than any other law enforcement agency in the country and have a bigger budget than the U.S. Marines. When I first saw that, I said, well, that can't be right. I looked it up and it's actually true.
That the streets of Chicago would be safer if there were more uniformed police officers on the streets of Chicago.
I believe the city of Chicago and cities across America would be safer if we actually had, affordable housing. Look,
okay,
I'm not saying that
that's
we
not
don't.
the question.
Yeah, I mean, he doesn't want to hear it because the fact of the matter is, when we look at countries around the world, less poverty means less crime. Nobody wants to talk about that. Less opportunity means less crime. Jobs means less crime. Opportunity, obviously, a person who has a lot of opportunity is not going to say to themselves, well, let me go snatch a handbag. Why would they do that? Because you already have your stuff. What do you need to take from somebody else? It's just a fact. It's just such a basic, obvious fact.
I ask. My question is, and I just need a yes or a no. Do you believe the streets of Chicago would be safer if you got all of those other extraordinary programs put back into place, which do have a history of being successful, if that's complemented by having 5,000 more cops on the streets of Chicago?
I don't believe that we should narrow it down to just police officers, Joe, is what I'm saying. That is an antiquated approach. I'm saying we've invested in detectives.
Mr. Mayor, are you hearing what?
It is an antiquated approach. Of course, we've already done that. It's not just that it's antiquated. We've actually done that. And actually, we're about to find out right now in Washington, D.C. It's kind of like saying, well, if we had just cops on the street and nobody else, no firemen, just cops, no social workers, nothing, of course you wouldn't have any crime. I mean, it would be like saying, with the military on the street all the time, of course, it's completely ridiculous. But it never ceases to amaze me how the answer to everything for some conservatives is we just have to have more cops. We're putting billions into overtime in the New York City Police Department, and everybody's good with that. But let's put billions more. One could actually ask the question, too, from a logic perspective. If you have all these cops on the street, then why isn't crime going down? Of course, everyone knows that it really isn't cops on the street because cops don't do anything except show up after the crime is over. So you're not really, where is the prevention piece there? The mayor was actually talking about the prevention piece, and the prevention piece is the nuanced work that happens in the community that, once again, is not sexy. The media doesn't want to talk about it. The media wants, if it bleeds, it leads, because that's what makes them money.
What I'm saying, I'm agreeing with you that all of these other social programs are extraordinarily important. I just need a yes or a no, and then this will be the last time I ask. If you get all of those other social programs that 800 million that New York City does, Los Angeles, other people do with great success, would an additional 5,000 cops on the streets in Chicago help complement those programs to make Chicago safer?
Look, we are working hard to make sure that our police department is fully supported. I don't believe that just simply putting out an arbitrary number around police officers is the answer. What I'm saying is policing and affordable housing. It's policing and mental and behavioral health care services. It's policing and youth employment. It's a full package. Of course, we want to make sure that our police department is fully supported.
The police department is fully supported. I mean, the idea that the police department is not getting funded in these cities, particularly Chicago and Boston and Washington, D.C. and New York, is absolutely laughable. Has anybody actually looked at the police budgets? Has Joe Scarborough looked at the police budget? But he keeps asking this question because it's always got to be about cops. Cops are so a part of the culture in the United States that now it's become a completely indispensable discussion, right? And everybody, you saw how crazy everybody went at the words, which it started out as defund ICE, by the way. Then it became defund police. And the notion of it, that we gotta have And now we're into this sort of warrior cop, sort of militaristic style cop now. Now they've got these armored vehicles. I mean, imagine if we put into our schools what we put into our law enforcement, at least equally. Imagine if we did that.
That's why
Wow.
I've invested in our Detectives Bureau, because what we have seen in the city of Chicago, when we solve crime, it acts and serves as a deterrent. It's policing and all of the other efforts that we're doing. Here's the last thing that I'll say to that. The federal government could work stronger to coordinate with my police department to get guns off the streets of Chicago. We've seen these coordination efforts work. Just a couple of weeks ago, the ATF working with my police department, we removed over 150 guns off the streets of Chicago that were trafficked in through Mississippi and Indiana. No one is saying that police officers don't play an incredible role in driving safety. They play an absolute pivotal role in that. But we have asked law enforcement to do too much. Police officers are being asked to be social workers, counselors. What I'm simply saying is
that this is something right there that should have been at the top of the interview. And we now have a situation where the police are being called for truancy. They're being called, of course, for domestic violence disputes. Some of the time that can be understandable, certainly if violence is involved. Some of the time, you say to yourself, really? A police officer is supposed to be a marriage counselor. They're supposed to be a parent. They're supposed to be a guardian. They're supposed to somehow be clairvoyant and know that crime is going to happen before it happens. We are asking our police to do too much, which is why some of that money has to go into the things that are not very exciting to Joe Scarborough, apparently. So it was interesting to see Brandon Johnson, the mayor of Chicago, talk about those things, and everybody gets bored. Everybody in the media gets bored. They don't want to hear about that. They want to hear about bang, bang, shoot 'em up. They want it to be an episode of NYPD Blue or Blue Bloods or one of these cop shows. And if it's not like that, well, then we got to move the interview off of this idea that this nuanced, soft on crime stuff or soft power stuff. No. It's got to be bang bang shoot 'em up. Look, my dad was a cop, and there was a lot that was going on in New York. It's so funny to look at the stats because he had mentioned the amount of murders in Chicago back in the 90s when he was a kid. Back in the 90s, my dad was on the job. They had a year, I think it was 2,000 people killed in New York, murdered in New York. Now it's barely 300 or 400. So I guess something is working, and it's not just increasing the number of cops. I think there's like a 47,000 uniform officer army in New York. But I don't think the goal is to increase people who walk around with guns. The goal is to not need them in the first place, right? I mean, or maybe that isn't the goal. Maybe it isn't the goal. Maybe the goal is to have this industry, because you got to understand, law enforcement and cops is a business. Incarceration is a business. And sometimes when I watched that interview this morning and I watched Joe Scarborough, I thought to myself, this is the business end. We got to hire more people. We got to hire more cops. We're not talking about anything else except that. Very interesting. I'm Lauren Burke. There'll be much more, but it just shows you how everybody's on YouTube right now and reading Substack because of interviews like this. I'll be back soon.